One of the great themes in Pope Benedict, going back now many years, is the rapport between faith and reason. I think when he's in America, he will touch on the theme that was central to this Regensburg address, which, as you know, got him in so much trouble because of the reference to Islam. I think the central point in that talk is the importance of reason. And it might seem odd that one of the great defenders of reason in the 21st century is the Pope of Rome, but there it is. I think what he was criticizing in Islam is a tendency so to stress God's transcendence that the will of God becomes primary. That means that God does what he wants, he wills whatever, without reference to reason, to order, to structure. When that happens, religion is open, he fears, to obscurantism, to superstition, and ultimately to violence, because will is not reined in or controlled by an appeal to reason. Now, if you read on in the Regensburg talk, he is equally critical of a modernism, a liberalism that puts a similar stress on will. But instead of talking about God's will, it talks about our will. We are autonomous. We decide what's right and wrong. We decide what's good and bad. Well, see, that in a similar way opens us to extremism, ultimately to violence. If there's no appeal possible to reason, then how are you and I going to adjudicate our disputes? We can't. It's simply my will against your will. Now extrapolate to the national level. What adjudicates a dispute between nations? Nothing. My will against your will. My army's bigger than yours. I think what he saw, both in the religious realm and in the secular realm, was if we understress reason, we open the door to extremism and to violence. So that's why it's a very subtle and important call to everybody, religious and secular alike, to reason. But if you dissociate reason from faith, then reason becomes cold, flattened out, ultimately violent. What he wants is reason and faith in a kind of healthy, tensive coherence. And that, he thinks, is the key, not only to intellectual clarity, but to peace. It's the falling apart of faith and reason that's led to so much strife. I think the Pope read September 11th as a violation of reason. He saw it as an expression of religion that was untethered to anything reasonable. It was a pure expression of will, or the will to power. What that leads to is violence. In a similar way, in the excessive expressions of modern secularism, you also see a will to power. You also see a bracketing of reason. He sees them as two sides of the same coin, really. And so I think he's a great prophet right now, calling us away from the way of violence. And he associates that with the path of reason. The highest name of God in the Bible is in the first letter of John. God is love. That, by the way, is the ground for the Trinity. If God is love, then there has to be, in the very being of God, a lover, a beloved, and the love that they share. And so the Christian idea of God as triune is simply a commentary on that phrase, that God is love. I think, though, it's also important because it holds off two false views of God. See, to love means to will the good of the other as other. That means it allows the other to be other, and it's connected to the other. That's the move of love. We'll look at two false views of God. On the one hand, there's deism. Most Americans, I would guess, or many Americans, I should say, are kind of implicitly deist. God is this great supreme reality, but distant from the world, far removed, maybe the first cause a long time ago. Well, the trouble there is that God lets the world be, that's true, but that God's not really connected to the world. That God is not implicated in the world, therefore not a God of love. The other extreme, I was just watching Star Wars last night, and you see it beautifully in Star Wars, is the pantheist view. God is just the all, the whole, the energy that runs through all things. God is nature itself. Well, that God's very close, that's true, but see, that God doesn't let the world be. That God is not really distant enough from the world to be a God of love. The creator God of the Bible, who has made the world from nothing, that means the world is not God, it's other than God. Good. And the creator is intimately involved in every aspect of the world. That is the God of love, who can really will the good of the other as other. I think Cardinal Ratzinger, and now Pope Benedict, has seen for many years that getting clear about the nature of God is very important for understanding how we relate to each other and how we relate to God. Now, of course, Pope Benedict is a European. He was formed in a European high culture. He knows that world well. What he laments, he's been doing it now for decades, is the loss of religion in Europe. In the sort of the cultural homeland of Christianity, Christianity is withering on the vine in many cases. Well, this bothers him very deeply. He looks to America and he sees a sort of paradox. You see a paradigmatically modern country, the United States of America, formed in the great revolutions of the 18th century. Yet America is not hostile to religion. America is rather vibrantly religious. Now, where does that come from? His opinion is this. In Europe, the church was so identified with the old cultural and political structures that when they were overthrown, religion was overthrown too, or at least became suspect. The same did not obtain here. There was more of a separation between the political, cultural structures and the church, so that when we rebelled against one, we didn't have to rebel against the other. So it's allowed for a greater religious vibrancy. And then in our Constitution, the separation of church and state, he reads as to some degree a good thing. It's allowed religion to flourish independently of government and the culture. Now, there's a negative side as well to that, which he's also talked about. Because we separate church and state, there's a tendency to say religion is private. Religion's a private matter. It's in the privacy of your heart that you can cultivate it, but it doesn't come out publicly. Well, see, both John Paul II and Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, are very much opposed to that, because Christian religion has to come out publicly. Non-violently, I mean, God knows we have a bad history around that, of coming out very violently. We must always come out non-violently. Nevertheless, we are a public religion. It's meant to affect the culture, the political realm, interpersonal relations, neighborhoods, all that. And we can't allow it simply to recede into privacy. I think he sees the right solution as the tension between those two extremes. And I think that's what he sees in America that's both intriguing and troubling.